Welcome, everyone. Kevin Carpenter here, and I'm with Daniel Steinberg. And this is an interesting, this is going to, this will be new to me because this is for SwiftCraft. Um, if anybody else has seen me before, it's mainly for C++ conferences. And so we'll see how this goes. Daniel, welcome. How you
Wow,
doing today?
way to sell it. This sounds just like it's I'm great, thanks for calling.
Well, it can go up, it can go down, it can go sideways. Either way, I am sure I will learn a lot. So SwiftCraft, new conference this year in Folkestone, and you're a keynote speaker, and you're also giving a class, right? Um, and you've been doing Swift for a long time. I was telling you before we started, like I watched part of your talk, The Ugly American, and that was, if I remember right, that came out right after the first release of Swift.
Right, that was a .Swift conference which no longer exists, but that was in Paris, yeah.
So how was, I was watching that, and I'm like, how was the crowd giving that talk in Paris? Because you had some great references. Because I'd been to Paris and I was like, it. I just thought it was beautiful the way you referenced Starbucks and McDonald's.
Well, that was a negative reference, actually. It was
I know.
people that go to Paris and miss the fact that there's culture all around them. They were wonderful. I loved Paris.
Yeah, we the when my wife and I went, we loved it too. I will say though that my wife was partial to McDonald's macaroons. It's like it was surprisingly really good quality, better than what you got at the airport. That was for sure.
Okay.
So, how long have you been doing Swift now? I mean, literally
Since
since the
then,
beginning.
I was at the keynote where they announced Swift and wrote to my designer and asked her to design the book cover while I was sitting in the audience because I saw that this was going to be the future and I wanted to have an early book on it.
Wow. And I know you've got the Swift Kickstart UI and Swift Kickstart books plus several others, correct?
Probably a dozen others, yeah.
Oh my gosh. So this is the part where I was laughing at myself when I started because, my naivety is going to show through, I spend most of my time in Golang and C++ and for fun this year I decided to pick up Python and, now I'm going to pick up a fourth language which will be Swift. Um, so your talk that you're going to do, as I read the title of it, it's called "A Mathematician Muses About Macros." Is that macro models since it's the app, or is that a decorator and ML? I'm guessing machine learning. Yes.
So it's commas, it's macros, model, and ML that the things that have come out recently in Swift and the things we expect this year.
But when I was reading the description, it was just interesting because you talk about, how do you pick out what to learn? And so I'm interested to hear about that because that's where I'm just saying, for all the languages that we have out there, and in watching your ugly American talk, it's like you talk about all these different things that got pulled together to make Swift what it is. How do you pick what you learn?
So some of it's just because I'm interested in it. Some of it I guessed wrong. A couple years ago, I guessed Combine, and Combine had it's not gone, but it's not being actively developed anymore. I was very interested in Swift data, and not just Swift data, but Swift data as part of the story of data flow. So people come to Swift UI, and the GUI is beautiful, and it's very easy to write something that looks really nice. But this idea of how does data flow through the app is really important, and part of that story is Swift data. So I thought that that fit in nicely, and so that was the story I decided to tell this year, along with the Swift macro story.
Nice. So when it comes to, and again, being the neophyte that I am, when you're moving data through, I mean, most Swift apps they follow the model view kind of controller, or is it a paradigm on top of that that makes it, in your view, even better?
Well, you're poking me with a stick because people made all these arguments that we aren't using model view controller anymore. We're using MVVM, or we're using MVVP, or we're using or MVP, or we're using something else. They're all basically MVC. You're basically separating them into stacks. And something that's been happening in Swift UI lately that I'm not so happy about is we're losing the controller layer. Apple is pushing more and more things that used to be in a controller layer into the view. And so that's something I worry a little bit about. For instance, In Swift Data, we have the at query, and at query is how you query the model and say, give me all of the somethings. And that now sits in the view, which, boy, I'd like that to sit in the controller still, but you can't fight City Hall.
Yeah. Yeah, I can understand that there. And it's interesting you say that because even as I was learning, like I said, I decided to learn Python for a specific small app that I made for a conference for ordering lunches, and that part where you're talking about whether something sits in the controller or the view, of course, with Python and like Flask, it ends up being, a web based. So you really have that separation, but where you're making those calls from, I can see the design difference when it comes to using it in Swift. What's your concern with it being more in a view versus controller? Is it just the engineering of it and maintainability of the code, or do you think it'll end up being a performance issue, or am I off on left field?
I worry that we're getting back to where we'll fall into habits of using too big classes or too big structs. I like very small, easy to describe, easy to test, easy to compose pieces. And SwiftUI has been that, and Swift encourages that. And especially if you use a functional programming paradigm, or some of the paradigms that are pushed out there, you can write these very small composable pieces. I worry if we put too much in the view and we lose that middle piece, that we're going to put too much where it doesn't belong.
Yeah, the small composable pieces, at least for all the other languages I work with, that really gives us a lot better reuse, at least in what I've seen. Would you
That's why
say
I don't
that's the
really
same?
care what we call it. If you call it MVC, if you call it whatever, it's just getting these things that are easy to define, easy to work together, just so that you have an idea of what you're
Gotcha. Right. So you're doing introduction to Swift macros as a workshop at the conference. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I've just put the wraps on the final chapter of my book on it. And so, what I tend to do after the conference is I think about what is it that I'm interested in, and I look around to see if someone else will write the book that I want to read. Because if someone else will write it, I'll just buy it and read it. Uh, Sometimes nobody will, and
Yep.
sometimes Apple has documentation that's sufficient, and sometimes they don't. With macros, I never thought I'd be interested in it. I walked around last year around DubDub saying, "Oh my gosh, why would anybody use this?" And the more I asked it, the more I thought, "Huh, this is kind of interesting." And one of the things you see, I don't know if you've done any coding for iOS or Mac, but if you build a Swift UI app, the first thing you get with a view is a preview. And the preview has gotten really nice because now they use a macro for the preview. And so you just say pound preview, and in curly braces, you say, here's the thing I want to show you. And so all
Mhm.
that boilerplate code that we used to have to list isn't there anymore. And it knocked me over the head and said, oh, these macro things might be useful.
That's interesting. So, because I was watching one of your tutorial videos on macros, and at least, because I spend a bit of time in C++, it made me think of the way we do template meta programming, kind of
Yes.
with the generics and such like that. And so I do like, the one thing I've found as I've learned different languages is I love what I learned from each of the languages. So, in C++, we use a lot of tuples, and I didn't use them near as much until after I used Golang for a while. I jokingly say with Python, I'm still trying to figure out what I learned because I'm not Python itself. I'm just, but that being said,
I mean,
with a
just to interrupt you there, that's
no, go
actually
for it.
we're at a very key moment in Swift, because in the beginning of Swift, everybody is coming from a different language. But 10 years in, we now have people that this is the only language they've used. And I think you're absolutely right. The more languages we use, the more we bring into our own language and say, why do we do it this way? Or we appreciate the things that are special about the language that we're in.
That is absolutely true. And it's interesting too because I mean you've been programming for multiple years as well, and it's like when I think about the amount of languages I've also forgotten, but you still maintain you get this intuition as you continue to use languages. It's like whether you're seeing the patterns more as they cross languages, or understanding just deeper on the computer science part. um, it's a great learning path, I think, and just growth wise. Yeah.
And you get immune to the hype where someone says, now for the first time we can do this, and you think, we could do this before, we just called it something different.
Yeah. That is absolutely true. So listen, I'm really looking forward to seeing you at SwiftCraft. I'm looking forward to your keynote. Um, First time conference. Have you ever been to Folkestone?
When I was very, very young, we were in England for a year while my dad was on sabbatical, and so we went all over. And so we did get to Folkestone and Dover, and then west to Cornwall, and so on.
So as you know, then Dover is closed. So if you're coming down for the conference, take a couple extra days. You can go see the White Cliffs of Dover. And I will say the one thing I love about Lee's Cliff Hall is as you're walking up to it, you see this dome. It looks like a coffee shop, and you're like, "We're having the conference in here." And then once you walk in, you walk down the stairs, and it just opens up into this beautiful hall. Um, so I look forward to seeing you, Daniel. I really appreciate your time today. And I will certainly pick up more Swift before I see you at SwiftCraft.
My pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Thanks.